let's talk about a charity founded by King Charles, because they plan to stop young people moving away from the countryside to help bolster rural communities. The Rural Countryside Fund is hoping to raise £15 million over the next 4 years to invest in innovative rural projects to help farming families. The expansion has the firm backing of the King, who has long cherished a deep love of rural life. I've got rural commentator Rafe Heydel-Mankoo with me here to discuss this. Rafe, welcome back to the show. It's an interesting situation, this, isn't it? Because there are two, for me, sort of very distinct parts of the countryside. There's the people who live sort of rather high on the hog in the stately homes and the rather nicely run farms. And then there's the rest of them, the people who sort of don't really make very much money, who don't live in vast, sort of estates, and who grub around doing pretty blue-collar jobs most of the time.
Absolutely right. And the King, of course, is one of those stately home dwellers, but he's always been passionate about those very disadvantaged communities you're talking of. So this actually is a good news story to discuss.
Is it?
The King founded this royal fund in 2010 precisely to help struggling for farming and rural communities. His Majesty has always had, a deep and abiding love for the rural lifestyle, for farming and for rural communities. And they really do need help. Only 6% of farmers in this country are under 35.
Yes.
2/3 are over 55. The farming community have declining standards of living on every level. The incomes are going into free fall. The ability to even face up to competition from abroad now is increasing, particularly badly. And people aren't being trained in land management techniques, in basic skills. For years, the King has had a charity which has trained people in doing things like drywall construction.
Yes.
There's wonderful English walls.
Yeah, absolutely.
All of these skills and traditions are being lost, and the King has really done for a long time what he can to try to improve that. And so what this fund is doing is really trying to ensure that there will be a future for young people, because the brain drain that we're seeing from the countryside to the cities is so dramatic and drastic that the entire farming world probably has never been in such a bad situation as it is right now.
And has it also been impacted by the sort of moving out of people? I remember when I was looking to buy a house the first time, way back many, many years ago, 30-odd years ago, there was a sort of a knock-on effect, a bubble effect, if you like, where people couldn't afford to buy in London, so they moved outside to sort of the M25, and then suddenly the next lot of people couldn't afford the M25, so they moved out to the home counties, and then the next lot, I was one of the sort of the third lot. I ended up going to live in Wiltshire because it was all I could afford to do at the time, and I bought a very nice, sort of workman's cottage for about some ridiculous amount of money, like £70,000 in kind of 1997, which now is probably worth, 4 or 5 times that. But there was very little to do for the kids. My children grew up there, and almost to a man and woman, by the time they decided to either go to university or whatever, they wouldn't come back to work in any of those communities because there wasn't really anything to do unless you wanted to work in a local supermarket.
Yeah, well, much like the seaside towns as well around this country. And, of course, there's also a problem with second home dwellers, of course, who want, because they only live in these properties for a part of the year. All of the local infrastructure...
These will be, of course, the Just Stop Oil Brigade, who've got rich parents.
So Pippa and Peregrine.
And Rumbelows and all Indigos and all that, because they can live high on the hog, as I say. They don't have to work. And when they want to go and demonstrate in London, that's fine. Yeah,
all those Cotswold sets and so forth. But, of course, all of the local infrastructure, therefore, becomes eroded because people aren't dwelling there so much. You just had, one of the guys from the Amazon show with Jeremy Clarkson.
Oh, yes.
Just bought a pub in his local village. Not with the intention of making it profitable, but just because he wants to have a pub in his village, and these places can't survive
because they keep shutting them down.
Because they keep closing down, because people aren't drinking as much, but people aren't actually living in these communities 365 days of the year. So this is a real crucial problem that we're facing. And what the King's Fund is trying to do is to actually try to bring into these areas more investment. So they've got around 6,000 businesses across the country that they're working with to try to find novel ways, innovative ways to bring people back into these places and make them once more thriving hearts of a local community. Because once you start it up, others will, if you build it, they will come.
If you build it, they will come. Well, I'm a great believer in that, but I'm also a great believer in the government then giving tax breaks to people and giving people more of their own money to invest in businesses if they wish to. But, I mean, to start a small business in this country now, it's got so much red tape attached to it that it's absolutely unbelievable. And people are put off by it. And many people are closing businesses now rather than opening them. So they're going to have to go some, I think, aren't they, to try and actually stimulate people in different areas.
It's a hugely difficult issue. And we also need to have an adult conversation in this country as to whether we're willing to pay more for our food or if we want cheap food. Because, of course, one of the great dilemmas for the farming community, and you always have the farmers union on to discuss this, is, of course, the fact that they're so fearful of cheap food coming in from, say, Australia or from America, possibly from Canada. And they want, of course, to have protectionism for their industry. And we need to decide, well, actually, how much is the British farming community worth to us? How much subsidy should it get? How much protection should it get? So these are all discussions.
We also have the dreaded net zero conversation to be had as well, because we saw finally farmers driving their tractors around Westminster, didn't we, a couple of months ago, following on in the footsteps from the French, the Dutch in the Netherlands, the Germans as well, because successive governments in Europe and the EU, and I know we're no longer part of that, but we still sort of suffer under the yoke of globalism, farmers being told, well, you can't actually grow that particular crop there because we want you to not use fertiliser on it, or we want you to hit a net zero target, and that's another issue for them.
Well, yeah, it's the big elephant in the room. I mean, £15 million is great. It's a drop in the ocean when you consider the actual economic cost of trying to meet net zero targets. And the government surely, I would think, would have to have some sort of package to go along with this net zero thing, because the support that it's giving to farming communities right now simply isn't enough, given that the damage that it's being caused by trying to meet net zero standards.
Right. Presumably, if you were a youngster growing up in a rural scenario now, you would not want to be a farmer. You wouldn't decide to walk into your local bank and say, I've decided to start a farm. I'm going to buy some land, I'm going to grow some food, and that's how I'm going to make my living, because they'd go, have you gone insane? Why would you want to do that?
The only people who are farming really these days are those who were born into the trade. It's all that they know.
Right.
But as I said, only 6% of those under 35 want to carry on farming.
Yeah.
It's a thankless task. You get such little reward for it. And the actual energy expended is so great. Getting up at 4 or 5 in the morning, it's a full day's work. I mean, actually, I wish
proper work.
All people should be made to go and work on some of these farms, actually, and maybe they'll change their views afterwards. But I mean, I don't know anybody who would willingly go into the farming community now.
Yeah, I mean, also it says here one of the projects that the fund supports is Countryside Learning Scotland, which works to combat rural skill shortages by expanding outdoor learning in secondary schools. I mean, that's the other problem, is that when you live in those, and because I've lived there, in some of these rural places, the transport links are terrible. If you happen to be near a main railway line, that's all fine and dandy. But if you're not, there are some, I mean, I lived in a village in Wiltshire where there was one bus that went into the main town in the morning at 9 o'clock, and another one that came back in the afternoon at 3 o'clock. And if you didn't have a car, you weren't going anywhere.
Oh, yeah.
So a lot of older people couldn't even go shopping. The schools were not very well supplied with teachers. They didn't really have a very good academic record in many ways. The good schools in the countryside tend to be private. It's very, I mean, the whole situation has been allowed to deteriorate, it seems to me.
Well, everyone's talking about having these 15-minute cities,
Yeah.
I think it would be much more useful to actually try to provide that sort of a network
in a town,
in a village, in the countryside, where people actually can have the services that they need.
Call me old-fashioned, walk down a high street and there's the butcher, there's the vegetable salesman, there's a dairy.
With the local produce.
With the local produce, which is coming from
But that's why I think
area.
training people in secondary school, introducing them is great, because, why send everybody off to universities? We talk about apprenticeship schemes for people in sort of industry, but actually we should be doing the same thing for people in rural communities to give them that passion for farming and the skills that they need, business skills and technical skills, to become successful, and therefore people can actually, work and live in the communities in which they were born.
Exactly. And we'll talk about this, I'm sure, later on when the panel return, but at the end of the line for failing train firms, I mean, one of the things that has really affected the countryside is the lack of train sort of branch lines, many of which were closed many years, certainly before you were born, but in the 60s, by the report that was brought in then, which said, well, we don't need any of this because everybody's going to be driving around. And now there's no infrastructure where people can go from point A to point B to even work in a job without a car.
Well, if only we hadn't spent so much money on the furlough scheme. Levelling up would have actually provided.
Do you know what I'm getting sick of as well, listening to various different alternative outlets, and I don't include ours, where people have all suddenly woken up to the fact that lockdown was a terrible thing. I mean, you can't turn around now without hearing some pundit telling me how bad lockdown is. You know, we've been saying it, and we were saying it at the time. We were saying it was going to kill the economy. We were saying it was going to be terrible for the NHS. And now suddenly everybody's agreeing and going, oh, well, we knew that was going to happen. Well, why didn't you bloody well say it then?
Lockdown and puberty blockers.
Yes.
Suddenly, all of these people are now saying, oh, yes, well, we always knew this.
Yes.
I actually think those two events coming together so closely may mark something of a turning point with many people beginning to think, actually, have I been wrong on anything else as well?
Yes, the return of common sense. It could well be. Absolutely unbelievable stuff. Rafe, thank you very much indeed.